Good afternoon. My name is Dominique McCoy, and I'm the Associate Director of Engagement for the To&Through project. On behalf of my colleagues, I'd like to welcome you all to today's discussion. The To&Through project aims to increase the high school and post-secondary completion for historically marginalized groups in Chicago public schools. Through this work, we aim to provide Chicago's vast network of educators and community stakeholders with access to research-backed data on education and students' educational experiences, as well as opportunities for dialogue on the implications that this data may have on the practices and policies impacting our students. Today, we are leaning into the latter half of our mission through a discussion which we've organized in support of our recently released report, The Educational Attainment of Chicago Public Schools. This annual report, which we released with our partners at the Chicago Consortium on School Research, aims to provide an understanding of the current state of educational attainment in CPS and an annual measurement of our city's progress in offering equitable access to a college degree for all students. Though it's an imperfect and incomplete metric, the differences in educational attainment that we see by race and gender provide a system-wide view of the different learning opportunities and career pathways to which different groups of students have access. As part of this year's report, we debuted a new metric we're calling the Post-Secondary Attainment Index that uses current rates of high school graduation, college enrollment, and 2-year and 4-year college completion to project the number of current CPS freshmen who we predict would earn a college degree or credential over the course of the next 10 years. A key finding of this year's report is that if current rates hold, 13 out of every 100 Black young men who are 9th graders currently in CPS will complete a college credential in the next 10 years. So again, to contextualize this number, we try to walk ourselves through a bit of a thought experiment. So again, if we're thinking about 100 Black young men who are currently in 9th grade, using current rates, and if these rates do not change, we would project that 73 of those young men would graduate from high school within 4 years. Of those 73, 28 would immediately enroll in a 4-year college. 11 would immediately enroll in a 2-year college. And of those students, providing them with 6 years to complete their degree or credential, we would project that 10 4-year college enrollees, 1 2-year college enrollees, and 2 non-immediate enrollees would earn a college degree or credential within the next 10 years. Interpreting this data forces us to hold 2 truths in our head. First, that there are Black men from CPS who are graduating from college, providing us with a starting place to celebrate these young men's accomplishments and to learn from their lived experiences. Yet at the same time, this data also demonstrates that in its current design, our education system is not built to help enough of our young Black men thrive on a pathway to a college degree. Today's conversation is about wrestling with that tension. And to help us interpret the data, we would like to call on the brilliance of Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who in 2006 coined the term the education debt, to help us frame the educational disparities we see within the context of the opportunities and resources that have been historically held back from students of color over the decades. As Dr. Ladson-Billings describes, the conception of this debt is not only financial, but it is also historical, socio-political, and moral, and that the repayment of this debt will require a constant interrogation of the practices and policies in place to support our young people, particularly those least served by our system, along their individual educational journeys. To help us unpack this debt today, I am thrilled to be joined by an esteemed panel of educators, leaders, and Black men who have dedicated their careers to creating a more equitable and just education system in our city. So with that, I'm very excited to introduce today's panelists. Um, First, we have Dr. Shawn Jackson, who is the president of Truman College. During his 15-year span in primary and secondary education, Dr. Jackson has served as a teacher and administrator, as well as Chicago Public Schools Chief of Leadership and Learning. He is known for his innovation in education, utilizing technology as a means to stretch learning beyond classrooms, designing initiatives to engage parents and communities in the process of learning, and expanding opportunities for students across the city of Chicago. We also have here with us today Dr. Marie Sweeney, Chicago Public Schools' first Chief Equity Officer. Dr. Sweeney examines CPS policies and programs for inequities and implements strategies to minimize disparities in resources, staffing, and high quality academic programming. As a longtime educator, his focus on post-secondary readiness and social emotional learning characterized his tenure as principal at Edward Tilden Career Academy High School, where his leadership has been recognized throughout the country. And finally, we have Dr. Kyle Westbrook, who's the founding executive director of the Partnership for College Completion, which works to champion policies, systems, and practices that ensure all students in the Chicago area, particularly low-income and first-generation students, graduate from college and achieve their career aspirations. Dr. Westbrook has spent 20 years in public education, serving in roles ranging from history teacher at Lincoln Park High School and Walter Payton College Prep to be a district level administrator, as well as being the executive director of education policy for the city of Chicago. So please join me in welcoming our guests. This would be the point if we were actually in person that we would have rapturous applause, but we're just gonna have to pretend it's happening. But thank you all so much for joining me today. Quick note too, these three, they did not want me to spend so much time reading out all their accomplishments, but I told them we had to start to force them to stand in their shine. So thank you all for joining. I'm incredibly excited for the conversation we get to have today. So to start things off, you know, we've talked a lot, open to having this conversation go where it needs to, but you know, to start things off, I think one thing that stood out to me, you know, across all of your bios, right, is that you all started your careers as educators, right, both in the classroom and as school leaders. And so, you know, I would like to just start by asking you all, as you think back in your experience as educators, you know, what were some of the things that you tried to make true for the young men in your classrooms and in your school communities?
I'll jump in just so I don't have to follow Dr. Jackson. Um, I'll start and just thank you, Darren, for really putting this together, and really thank you for your leadership and really thinking about how, you know, this group of panelists, but also very broadly how the work that you're doing at To&Through can really be supportive of our young men of success, young men of color and their success in the Chicago Public Schools. And I'll just start by giving a shout out, and I think it's appropriate to, you know, when I was a beginning teacher in Lincoln Park in '95, the very first person I met was an older brother named Freddie Jordan. And Freddie was a teacher there, and Freddie reached his hand out, you know, to a 22-year-old. I don't even know if I was 22 at the time. I think I was like 21. You know, like literally wet behind the ears teacher, and took me under his wing. And that set a really powerful example for me. Literally from the very first day I was a teacher, of the importance of mentorship and the importance of connecting with other Black men in the space. And I, you know, I happened to come into the system when there was still a fairly large number of Black teachers in the Chicago Public Schools, which I know is an ongoing challenge for the district right now. But, you know, I look back and think about, you know, there was like 15 Black male teachers at Lincoln Park High School in 1995. I don't know what the number is now, but I doubt it's a fraction of that right now. And so, thinking about my sort of journey in leadership into the classroom and beyond, one of the things that's always been important to me is to be that Freddie Jackson. First, when I was a teacher, being that Freddie Jackson to other young men, young brothers in my classroom, and knowing that my classroom was a safe space for them, no matter what, and no matter who they were. Um, and then later in my career, being that Freddie Jackson to other teachers, young teachers that were coming along. And then certainly now at this point in my career, being that Freddie Jackson to other young Black men that are working in the policy space, and there are many of us working in the policy space in other sectors, and continuing to really live by that credo that so many of our folks that came before us was sort of each one teach one, and making sure that I'm always reaching back to young people to help to support them.
Okay, I'm going to chime in. I hate going behind Dr. Westbrook, and I definitely don't want to go behind Dr. Sweeney. So, both of my parents were teachers, and I tried not to be a teacher, and then I ended up being a teacher. But what that did was it instilled the benefits of education really early, even though I tried to get away from it. I'm a brother from the west side of Chicago, Austin, if anyone here is with us from Austin. And I had the great opportunity to serve as a teacher and building leader, principal in my own neighborhood, which is a whole different sense of commitment. What's interesting though is it wasn't until later in my career when I reflected that the only Black male educator that I interacted with was the one I had at home. And I also had the opportunity to understand that everyone's interactions weren't the same as mine when it came to the benefits of education. And so those two elements of my upbringing drove how I taught in the classroom, as well as how I led my institution in the elementary school space. And now here as president of here as Truman College, is understanding that our job is to create a value system around education. You can't just assume that people think, education is a good thing because we say it's a good thing. All right. So the responsibility of that is truly on the educators and the leaders that are being charged to lead those educational institutions. We're asking students to wait years for reward. And anyone that has been an educator in the inner city understands the competing factors that you have before these students even get to a classroom. And so what drove me, or at least how I wanted my classroom to look, or education space, regardless if it was leadership or otherwise, was giving students an opportunity to engage in not just educational opportunities, but just access to opportunities, period, that they may not get at home, that their neighborhood may not give them, and really just taking a comprehensive look at what the learning process looks like for students, and recognizing that their parents, I may be working for a system that failed them. So, right, so before you even get into the books, the X's and O's, the curriculum, or whatever, what have you, it's getting a belief system and understanding that education can work for you and education is for you, and being able to develop a system that allows them to feel connected to that opportunity of education.
So I got to go behind y'all, huh? Let me, first of all, I am excited to share space with y'all. This is, I know it says panel, but this is like a Black male therapy session for me. Because as Black men in education, you always look to for what's the answer, what's the strategy. And rarely do we find ourselves in spaces of like being in community and just kind of like talking. So I appreciate that. When I look back, so this is my 20th year and I still feel young. I still feel like I have a lot of fresh energy to give. And I grew up very Black. And what I mean by that is I had Black teachers, Black schools. I'm from New Orleans. I lived down the street from Xavier University where I got my bachelor's and my master's. Like my whole experience was cultivated, or like Dr. Gholdy Muhammad talks about cultivating genius. I feel like they were always reminding me of who I was and sharing stories about who my ancestors were. And when I became an adult at 21, like you, Dr. Westbrook, wet behind the ears, realizing that my experience was not everybody else's experience. And, you know, my dad, before he passed away, one of his final sort of words to me, he was like, all was well until crack hit the streets. And when he told me that about 5 years ago, it reminded me of when the family started to break down and ways in which my community stepped in to be of a support to me. And I say all that to say, the way systems were working against Black people, the communities were always around to cultivate it. And I think what I ran into as an adult was all of the systems that should be supporting the development and growth of adolescents, of young people, were working contrary to Black children when you think about zero tolerance policies and all of those things. And that it was systemic, and that it was structural, and that it was institutional. And I think that has been sort of like my motivation to do more institutional and structural work in the district so that we can do the transformative work in classroom spaces. And I also want y'all to know I got my little work. I'm taking notes because y'all gonna say something good. So if y'all see me with my head down writing, it's because I'm thinking about what these gentlemen are saying to me.
I appreciate that. Hopefully we can get some good stuff for you. Kyle, do you have something?
Yeah, Don, I'm just gonna ask. I just like to ask and respond to some of the things that Dr. Jackson and Dr. Sweeney just said, and just and more of a question to Dr. Jackson. And maybe I don't want to steal your thunder, Dom, and take the microphone from you.
The less I can stay at the go. Let's do this. Let's do this. This is good.
And maybe can I just ask President Jackson, Dr. Sweeney, can we you? Because there's a way in which we talk when we're together. You know what I mean? Like that. That I want to hopefully feel natural. Dr. Jackson, I just want you in this really unique space, having worked both in K-12, and all your experiences, and now to be in higher education and to be in a really different space. I'm just curious, sort of, when you think about all the roles that you've played, what are some of the ways that some unique pushes on your role now as a Black male? Because again, even in the higher education space, Black males leading colleges, we don't see that very often. And I'm just curious, sort of how what you just talked about informs the work that you're doing now in that trajectory.
I agree with Dr. Sweeney. This is about to be a therapy session, so I'm going to have to put myself on a time limit. Let me first start by saying my time in Chicago public schools and working in a school in the inner city gave me the courage to lead, because I recognized that school meant so much more than a school report card or a quantifying number, if you will. We were everything to that community, right? And so when you understand the responsibility, and you all know this, that's bestowed on you in those type of spaces, everything else is easy after that, right? So my matriculation into higher ed has been extremely interesting. I'll say this, and I always tell this story, colleges, we're separately accredited, right? And we have this Higher Learning Commission that does all of our accreditation work. And roughly into my second year, I'm in my fourth year now, roughly into my second year, we had the opportunity to go to the Higher Learning Commission professional development that was here. And there was this opportunity for the presidents, right? There's this workshop. It's all of the presidents that are from around the country that are here to get this presentation. Now, I come from Chicago public schools. I've been in principal PDs. I've been in teacher PDs, this was the first. And I walked in and I could not find a soul that looked like me. it was one of the most humbling experiences I've ever had professionally. And let me tell you why. Because I was able to put myself in the mind of a student that I have not done in a very long time. I was walking around that room looking for a sense of connectedness that I could not find from a colleague, nor did I understand what the presenter was saying, because I was new to higher ed. I didn't know that this was a peer-to-peer thing. All of my career was in Chicago public schools. And so having that moment of humility and humbleness drives my work here in a community college, right? I sit here and I look at these numbers and it's insulting, right? What's interesting is our students have issues from the K through 12 space, many that they can't control. And for some reason, we think that when they matriculate into higher ed, that all of those things go away.
Yeah.
Right? And our colleges and campuses often do not reflect the needs of these particular students. And I'm not just talking about Black students. I know we're talking about Black male students today, but I've talked to my colleagues. This is about best practice, right? So to your point, Dr. Westbrook, taking those experiences that I've had and understanding, and you guys both know, being kind of the end all be all in that K through 12 space, I have transitioned that into my role here, which is a unique perspective. However, because it comes from my core, because I've had the fortune to work in public education in this city for close to 20 years in both spaces, it allows me to be grounded in that work. And when I see these students matriculate into higher ed, I recognize the responsibility that comes with that, because they had the courage to start their academic journey with us. And I recognize, because I've seen these students for so many years, what my campus needs to look like to support those students.
I appreciate that. Really appreciate that. I appreciate it from the standpoint of, that word responsibility, and how I think certainly the two of you, the three of us, have certainly felt this. At least I know I felt this career is not so much just about a career, but a responsibility, and a responsibility to take the benefits that have been bestowed upon me as someone who's been fortunate enough to have earned, advanced degrees, et cetera, and then turn that into some type of opportunity for our students, and particularly young Black men, and what often in spaces where opportunities are limiting for them, what's my responsibility to help sort of open those opportunities up for them, be they small or be they large. And I just really appreciated what you were just saying about like that responsibility and how that weighs so heavily, because this isn't just an academic exercise, or this isn't just a thing that I can just sort of say, all right, I'm done working in education, I'm gonna go sell insurance now, right? That it is something deeper, and it is, Maurice, as you were just saying, like being surrounded by folks that are pushing you, and really as examples of Black excellence, sort of how do I see myself as part of that continuum and part of that experience of Black educators, sort of, and community folk pushing our young people on to do better.
Yeah, during the pandemic, my team and I partnered with Chris Goings at My Brother's Keeper to do focus groups, one for Black male students, one for Black male teachers, and one for Black male principals. Part of it was around the healing, or the sort of way in which we needed to communicate around the murder of George Floyd by a white police officer, which was the systemic way of seeing Black death occur at the hands of white men over generations. And really taking some moments to process that, but also to ask ourselves, what do we need to heal and to thrive? And, one of the things that young men talked about specifically was you know, a lot of people think that we need mentorship, and their framing was, we need maybe a mentorship network like adults have, where you could reach out to different people for different things. But what they also talked about was like, where is a space for opportunity to really, really happen for us? Economic opportunity, because a part of the lack of success, if you will, is partially about how we serve young people. I own that as a district, that there is work for Chicago Public Schools to continue to do in service of Black children, specifically Black males in this case. I also realized the way multiple systems were taking their talent, multiple systems were exhausting them, multiple systems were causing trauma, and that in itself was impeding the learning that should have been happening in schools. And so, as I hear you describe like that emotional tax of people coming to you for the answers, and then hearing the complexity of what a real good answer is, it's very hard to like move through a system, and that system has to interact with multiple systems. And then people say, oh, that's too big. How do I sort of figure out my own space in that? And then you find yourself trying to like clarify and explain the role an individual can play. Like a friend of mine, Dr. Shezray Warren, is about to come out with a book called Centering Possibilities, which is essentially like, how do we look at Black children and see the assets, see the beauty, see the strength? And I say all of that complexity sort of adds up to this large education debt that we're talking about today and that we owe them. And it also reminds me of, where is a space for us to sort of keep our own healing front and center, so that it's not just about what are the answers or the strategies that we give, but what are the ways in which we take care of ourselves and push people on their practice.
I think you bring up an interesting point, Maurice. You know, part of, I think, all of your work is focused on helping institutions move, right? And that work is soul sucking in some ways. It can be, and that work can feel slow. But I'm curious, from each of your perspectives, what have been some of the places that you aim to start, right? When you've tried to approach, you know, again, like you're saying, these are big, complex, you know, interdependent policy issues that you are trying to address through an institution. And so, what has been some of your starting places?
I'll start with a recent starting place, and that's the Illinois General Assembly. You know, our organization, we exist to help close the equity gap in degree completion for Black and Brown students and low-income students. And one of the areas that we work in is in public policy. And, you know, as Dr. Swinney was saying at the outset, you know, it's policies that in most cases have helped to create the challenges that our students are facing, and have the greatest opportunity to help to address some of the fundamental problems that our students are facing. And, you know, you don't have to look too far. You don't have to look too much farther than the last couple of months, where you've seen the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus pass historic legislation in criminal justice, historic legislation in education, that over the next 5 years should make an impact on Black and Brown communities in Chicago and throughout the state. And working in the Illinois General Assembly, what's interesting to me is sometimes a disconnect between, you know, advocates on the one hand, and we sit in this strong advocate space, who are, you know, lobbying our legislators, who are working with our legislators on different pieces of legislation that we think are important, but often don't sit in, come from, or represent the communities that they're advocating on behalf of. And that disconnect can be profound. And so what's always interesting to me is going into these spaces in advocacy, where frankly, I am the only Black male, often the only African-American, that is in an advocacy space that is advocating on behalf of African-Americans. And it's not to say that you always have to have sort of Black leadership in every position. That's not what I would suggest. But there's clearly something that is happening in our system that may suggest that we aren't creating a space where young people can see that policy is a space where you can have as much impact as the classroom. And it's something that I've been thinking about more and more these years. But and then conversely, the legislators that we work with are often, obviously the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus, the Latinx Caucus. So there's this disconnect in this advocacy space that I'm beginning to think about, but also using the General Assembly as a lever to help both undo, but also do right by our students.
Yeah, I'll pick up. The Office of Equity launched in fall 2018, we produced a CPS 5-year vision, and then following that, an equity framework. And the reason why we went with a framework more than a series of initiatives and programs is because if institutional change is going to happen, it has to happen at a time where there is a lot of transition. And I'll be honest, when Dr. Janice Jackson became the CEO of Chicago Public Schools, I saw an opportunity to advance the need and the work and supports for Black people. I saw an opportunity to think about how do we now look at these systems and structures in a way to mitigate the harm that has been caused and to really do the right restorative work and opportunity work that will last longer than we are in the roles that we have. Sometimes though, the long game appears to ignore the sort of short time things that need to happen now. And so that balance, I would say from an equity office perspective is challenging. It's challenging for me in this role. Now, a few things that we did do well as an organization is that we did come up with Learn, Plan, Succeed, a way to ensure that young people are having a plan before they graduate from high school. So that holds us accountable as adults, no matter what your role is in the system, to ensure that young people have structure around what their future should be. We created a college roadmap to push ourselves and other organizations on what we do to support all children in the system, but we heavily call out the need for supporting Black children within the system. And I think we have to become more and more unapologetic about understanding how different groups are situated to a particular goal and focusing on who's farthest away from that goal and figuring out what are the strategies that we co-design with them in order to do that work. But I will tell you, producing a framework, teaching people the framework, having people interrupt themselves with the framework takes a lot of time. And what I can appreciate though is the people that I work with don't seem to be resistant. They are open to learning, and it just takes learning to do the right transformational work because systems have been interwoven and built, and they're connected to other systems, human services, transportation, healthcare, housing, that we have to think about how do we bring all these systems to bear to solve this education debt. Because when Dr. Westbrook said earlier, or Dr. Jackson said, families have been underserved. So if families have been underserved, then that means this is more than just what the current people within the organization are doing right now. We have to push on key levers from everything from taxation to, to where is the money, where is the resource, where is the power in order to really do this work well. And I think, one of the biggest aspirations is how do we go back and repay the harm from 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? And I think there are some ways actually to do that too.
I think, one thing that brings up for me, right, is that we have, decades of trauma and harm that's been affecting our communities, and we are also in a moment of trauma, right? We know that while we are all experiencing, this pandemic in some way, shape, or form, we are not experiencing this all equally, right? And so I do wonder, one, first and foremost, and Dr. Jackson, I should like to start with you. When you're thinking about, serving the needs of your students, particularly in this moment, where are you placing your focus? And then, for all of us, I'm also interested to hear, this is a moment, this is a moment of disruption in a lot of ways, right? We've been forced to try to do things different. And I'm wondering if that opens any opportunities from your perspective.
I want to start by making sure I give a shout out to Dr. Sweeney, because he's being extremely humble about that framework. And I appreciate him talking about the connectedness, because we were giving him a standing ovation from afar, where you see the interconnectedness of that piece of work. And when I say someone that used to work in that system, when I say they turned over every stone, it is extremely clear that they did that. So I need to make sure I give Dr. Sweeney props for that. I haven't had a chance to do that, so I want to take this moment. But speaking of that connectedness piece, I'm going to go back to what this opportunity gives us. And again, I don't want to sound too harsh, but as Dr. Westbrook said, I had an opportunity to come into higher ed, particularly in a community college setting, and knew that there was an antiquated viewpoint on how people looked at community colleges outside the system, didn't recognize that some of that harm is coming from inside of the system. And so having the opportunity to have worked with those students in the K through 12 space, knowing that they are taking, they have courage to start their educational career with us, again, that's a huge responsibility on us. So what the pandemic did is just exacerbate problems that we already knew existed, right? You knew there was a digital divide. You knew there were food insecurities. You knew there were socioeconomic issues in regards to job placement, job availability, access to education. We can go on and on and on. What it did in the education space, particularly that we had to move to remote, both in higher ed and the K through 12 spaces, it exacerbated some of those issues, particularly around the digital space. And so as a college, what we had to do is really start thinking, and I say from a best practice perspective, how we can best service our students is what we should have been thinking about anyway, right? So how are we making sure that students have access to food that relied on us as their access to food? How do we make sure that our library hours are open to give students access to technology that they may not have at home? How do we make sure that we keep our clothing so that we have something called True Closet here, where we have clothing, particularly for young children, that is readily available for free for any of our students? How do we make sure that those opportunities are accessible for our students and continue to be there for our students, even in this remote world? And so it really gave us an opportunity to really put the mirror on ourselves as far as looking at how we service students, because we had to do it differently. And the disparities became very real. So what it did from our perspective is it allows us to push on practice a little bit. It allows us to talk about, what does customer service look like in this space? What do additional resources look like in this space? And they're conversations that I would argue we may have become complacent in. But now, along with all the social unrest that has happened recently, has given us an opportunity to put a magnifying glass on practice and say, hey, this is not working, right? Before you even look at the data, this is not working. And we've taken advantage of that. And I would say my colleagues as well, there are 7 city colleges across Chicago. We've all developed equity plans, really looking at targeted populations a little different. And again, I'm quick to say, best practice is best practice, even though I know we are focused on a particular group of students. However, we are putting the mirror on ourselves and looking at our practices at our particular campuses in ways that we have not been able to do so before.
The only thing I would add just is it's those practices, and it's also sort of putting a mirror up on the policies. And just the real concrete example, something that we are thinking about and are watching very closely, is because of the pandemic, obviously everyone has moved online. Students aren't able to take SAT, ACT for college admissions. So virtually overnight, every college in America went test optional, or overnight, that happened in a way that was happening pretty gradually across the country. More and more institutions adopting a test optional approach. And, I'm fearful, and one of the things we're guarding against is, all right, once we move back into a world where all of our students are back into classroom, is the temptation on the part of institutions to sort of readopt some of those more harmful policies. And I say harmful from the perspective of Black people in general, who are disadvantaged when universities rely on those as a key metric in their admissions criteria. And we know that those the test scores don't tell us much about a student's ability to be successful in college. It tells us everything about a student's socioeconomic background, though. And so as much progress has been made out of necessity, I think, as Dr. Jackson was just saying, sort of at the institutional level, there's a question of sort of how do we keep that magnifying glass on those policies that have changed out of necessity that we need to now keep at the state level. What is the same calculus? And there's a bill in the General Assembly right now that would make test optional admissions sort of standard in law across all four-year public universities in the state. And those are the types of measures that have that kind of systems level approach to improving access and opportunity for our students. But again, one of my fears is just that folks will say, we're done with that pandemic. We're done with George Floyd protests. Now we can go back to the way business as usual, go back to 2019, which obviously would be a huge blow for students in our communities.
I want to try to start working in. We got a ton of great questions coming in, and just appreciate the community that's showing up today as well. I'm going to try to kind of aggregate a couple of these, but so one thing I think is actually a personal concern of mine, right, is that everybody on this call today, they chose to be here, right? Most likely they are steeped in this work, they are steeped in the data. And sometimes I worry that we have too many conversations, with ourselves, right? We talk about this a lot, and so, for the folks who aren't here today, one, who are the critical folks that need to be a part of this conversation, and particularly, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how you approach, calling in or out folks, into engaging. I think with what I appreciate, the picture that we painted is that we can't look at any of these numbers without context and without a reflection on our practice. So curious you can share how you approach that. And Dr. Sweeney, if you wouldn't mind starting.
Yeah, in the CPS equity framework, we talk a lot about liberatory thinking. And the idea behind it is, how does one interrupt their own beliefs and ideas? When we look at the percentage of white people who work within the organization, whether ally or racist, I don't know where people fall on that spectrum. And I don't even try to identify it, except I can help to identify a racist idea, which I think is more important than saying if a person is racist or anti-racist. I raise liberatory thinking up in this space because a lot of times people look for what's the resource and not what do I need to do to be different in service of the people in front of me. And I think to start to decrease this education debt, there are ways that we can continue to drive and do change as a system. What I will not skirt over is the ability for the person who is serving the children in front of them, whether it's a teacher, principal, paraprofessional, whoever that person is, has to interrogate their own racial identity and make sure that they're not reinforcing white supremacy culture or being Black people who are pushing for assimilationism, right? That you just got to cope and be good and do these things. I think that is important. I think for those of us who work in systems or at higher levels, need to remain empathetic and check our own bias and make sure that we're not upholding egregious institutional practices. I'm challenged by that every single day. I say all that to say, like, the human being is the critical strategy, the way in which we show up and be different. And if we can do that now and continue to sort of constantly churn and become better for the people we're serving, I think half of the education debt will be reduced. And then I think we can also continue, and I think people do right by pushing on any system to serve the people who it's responsible for serving better. So it's kind of like, how do I take on the personal interrogation of myself in service, and then how do I become a part of the solution and push the system for change? And I think you have to do both, not just one.
Ditto.
I appreciate that. You know, one thing I want to make sure that we create some time for too. You know, we've talked a lot, I think, in all of our personal stories about the power of representation, folks that were in this space together and creating community, particularly among Black men in the education space. Dr. Jackson, I want to make sure that we just spend a little bit of time. You could talk a little bit about some of your work that you've been doing to help foster some of that community, and particularly some of the opportunities to create pipelines to make sure that we are seeing more folks that look like us in classrooms.
Well, you can't see what you can't be.
Yes, sir.
Right? Right. You know what I'm saying? So, you know, we have, and I'm proud to say there's 3 Black male doctors on this panel, and we're not anomalies, but we tend to treat it as such.
Yeah.
And it's some indoctrination with that. So, you know, here at Truman, I was very clear, the only Black male teacher that was in front of me, I had one, and I had my dad, right? And didn't even understand the power in that. And so having the opportunity to be in part of higher education, something that I had preached to students, hey, go to college, go to college, go to college. And then now I can play a role in what that destination looks like. I take that really seriously. So part of our work is this Men of Color in Education that some of you may have heard of, and shout out to my brothers at CPS that have shown much love to supporting that initiative. Basically, we are trying to get more male of color in education. And the argument is we need to start earlier, right? We talk about if we celebrated teachers like we celebrate athletes, like we celebrate movie stars, think about what this world can be. And so we started this initiative a couple of years ago where we took a group of high school students, a group of students that are in CCC, and a group of community students, and matched them up with mentors. And all of our mentors were either Chicago Public School principals or administrators, and really talked them through the process of what it would take to be an educator, right? My colleagues can speak to this. Being a man of color in education is extremely lonely, right? If I was going to get my JD to be a lawyer or something, we would go and practice to pass the bar together, right? I'd have a group. Or if I was an MD, I would have a network of folks. When you are a Black male educator going through educated courses, you can't find anybody, right? And so it is the reason that we created this initiative. Outside of that, we added what we call the plug, right? And the plug is just a convening of men of color in education. And we broadened what education looked like, because it's not just, students just don't learn in the classroom. It's their interaction with security. It's a coach, it's a mentor. So coming together as a group of men of color around the belief in education and how we can support our learners is how we develop the plug. And then the last piece is we are delving into that out of school time space, because much of the learning that happens for our students and interactions that particularly our Black boys are having is happening outside of the classroom. So how can we ensure that they are having positive interactions with folks that look like them, that can continue to give them momentum to want to matriculate through our education system?
That reminds me, thank you for raising that, because I shout out to Miss Murray and Miss Strickland, who I know are not watching this right now, but they are the teachers who put me in a Future Teachers Club at the end of my 9th grade year, and is the reason I get to sit in this seat today. 2 of my 9th grade teachers, after I cussed one of them out, right? She pulled me next to her desk and she was like, we're gonna figure out a way how to use this energy you got. Which means that she didn't hold a grudge. She understand that I had something going on, and I really did during that time. In CPS, we have something called Teach Chicago Tomorrow. You know, and partnering with your brilliance, President Jackson, is around creating those systemic pipelines that really are comprehensive in relationship, right? Like, how do I support you and harness your own energy while setting you up into systems that can help you to be successful? So shout out to Teach Chicago Tomorrow, and tell people to sign up, because we're all about this work together. And to Dr. Westbrook's point, making sure that we don't have policies that push Black men out of systems is something that we have to continually pay attention to as well.
So we could clearly keep this conversation going for much, much longer. We are coming up against time. So, you know, again, I think I'm hoping we can end just there. You know, we talked about a lot. We talked a lot of complex systems. We talked about mindsets. We talked about a lot of work that needs to happen. But, you know, and not but, you know, what is giving you hope? What is keeping you in this work? What are the opportunities that you are excited to continue working towards?
What's giving me hope is a focus on Black leadership now, and it you know, you can't divorce it from the moment that we have all lived through in the last 8 months, but a focus on Black leadership at multiple levels. It seems like every time I open my LinkedIn, I see a Black CEO being appointed to a Fortune 500 company. I see, Representative Chris Welch being the new Speaker of the Illinois House. I see, Don Harmon, the Black President of the Illinois Senate, and gives me optimism. In part, some of those folks, I know personally, and I know, to Maurice, to your point, I know their values enough to know that they aren't pushing an agenda that minimizes their Blackness, but actually emphasizes their Blackness in their service to Black communities. And so I'm hopeful with this, and again, like, Dr. Jackson, having folks in leadership and Black leaders in our colleges and universities, in ways that certainly in my years in education I never saw before. That gives me hope that our voices that were once sort of seen can now actually be heard. And if our voices are at the table, or it's no longer the case that folks just want a Black face, but actually do in fact want Black voices at the table, it gives me hope that we can continue to move the systems that they don't make right turns. Systems don't make right turns. They make 1 degree at a time before you get there. That we can maybe go 2 degrees at a time, 3 degrees at a time, because the people in leadership understand some of the challenges that our communities face. And so I'm optimistic about, what's the path in the near term, the path forward.
I'll go before President Jackson. I think first of all, this conversation gives me hope because I feel better. To the earlier point about hanging out with y'all. I think what gives me hope is seeing Black youth in grocery stores being their authentic selves more and more, and not allowing systems to keep their head down. I think that, and making sure that I am, I'll be honest, when I see Black children in spaces, I'm always like, don't mess with them, right? So that they could be free and be youthful. And to still see youthful energy during a pandemic is actually pretty refreshing for me. Whether I'm, I just like to pay attention to my surroundings. And I think those small elements of curiosity and smiling gives me hope. I think to Dr. Westbrook's point, what gives me hope too is seeing the representation And also to his point around helping people to understand that systems don't just change because Black people are in place, right? We don't actually walk in with here is the power. We walk in with the will and the skill to do the work. I think is important to anchor. And I think what gives me hope too is how Black and brown people are coming together, and how Black and brown people are not allowing folks to co-opt the message of equity and to push for more racial equity. And while I do recognize that there are even some white children in systems in urban environments who are underserved, when we look at those who are demographically, systemically, and by group farthest from opportunity, we see people of color, we see Native students, and we cannot sacrifice the need to appease some to get to really the full needs of larger student groups. And so I'm appreciative of how people are starting to really take up the role of racial equity and social justice in a way that gives respect to the harm or to mitigating the harm that has been caused for generations.
And this is why you don't go after Dr. Swinney. So I am going to concur just by saying I'm thankful and the youth have a voice at the table because we're sitting here, right? And there are many others, principals, educational leaders, policymakers that are here now, and that gives me great hope. I also want to say that, you know, I keep sticking with this connectedness. You know, these two brothers right here have both given me feedback on my equity plan, right? You know, they are entrenched not just in the work for themselves, because they already have large projects and entities that they are working with, but they are adding their expertise and acumen to help others move the work. And there was a time that wasn't always
I think
like—
your sound went out, Doc.
I went out. Can you hear me now? No? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
I can't hear you. I can see you.
Okay, just really quick. Thank you, Dr. Swinney.
That's
Just an opportunity to work together and inform each other's work. Really appreciate to have that opportunity. It gives me great hope that you see that synergy across organizations.
Right. Thank you. I think first and foremost, I agree. I think this conversation is giving me hope. And personally, you know, I just want to say how much I've appreciated you all's leadership throughout the years and getting a chance to watch that. So thank you for allowing us the honor to be in conversation, to hold this space, to be in community together. And I'm looking forward to having more conversations like this. You know, this is something that we are really trying to make sure that we have these opportunities to really begin to fully understand what these numbers are telling us. And I think this is a great start. So thank you all so much. Thank you to everyone who has joined. Appreciate you all, and also you inspired me to get doctor in front of my name, because clearly you know, I was a little self-conscious, but I appreciate the opportunity even without it.
Thank you all for bringing us together, man. This is dope.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Dom, and thank you both. I always learn so much when I get to hear Dr. Swinney and Dr. Jackson. So appreciate everything that you all have taught us today.
Yeah, thank you.